Professor, it's great to have you here with me today, and I'm really honoured that you take the time to speak to me. Professor, I have one question of you.
Yes.
What is it like to be walking with the wind, with your whole career behind you, of success after success after success, to stop, turn your face into the wind and risk everything for what you believe and where your knowledge has taken you? What is that like?
Well, first of all, I can't imagine doing it any other way because that's what I believe in. What I cannot understand is the incredible. I find the words very difficult to find with regards to my colleagues in the medical profession, how they've been hoodwinked into going along with what the governments and agency have made them do. And when I have discussed this with them, they're frightened. I've got nothing to lose. I mean, I was past retirement age several years ago. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a matter of principle. But I appreciate a lot of them are using the excuse that they have been bullied, that if they stand up, and I regard it as standing up for their principles and their position, because as doctors, we're meant to first do no harm. And when we see harm being done all around us, it's our duty to report it, and a lot of us have. But the youngsters, when I say youngsters, anybody not at retirement age, is basically threatened with being dismissed, rather like with the mandates. And they've got mortgages and children at private school, etc. And they tell me we just can't afford this at our stage of our lives. So this is what the real crisis is. It's a real moral crisis, all the way down from the very top right to the bottom. And I've spoken, if I could just say, I spoke to a senior physician yesterday who I owe a lot of my career to. He made me a very good physician. And when I told him about this, his attitude was, "You're wasting your time. They will just argue they did the best in the best interests of the country and of the population." I said, "I can't believe you're saying this because it's clear that they didn't." So I'll just leave it at that.
I had a similar instance with two of my friends who are would put human rights and liberty and freedom at the top of the list of their career, their whole career. And when I said to them, I put my position to them, they said, "This is not a human rights issue nor a libertarian issue, Russell. This is a health issue." And they were also completely hoodwinked. One, he said to me yesterday or the day before, "I've gone and had my vaccination again." The other has woken up. Professor, even though you're at retirement age, we have a legacy at our age of what we've done, things we've done in the past, the things we've stood up for,
exactly,
everything that we knew to be right. Yet in this case, nobody questioned. I can't believe it. It's not only the medical community as a whole, but the Bureau of Statistics and the health departments and everybody on exactly the same boat, and they still are.
They still are. They're completely contaminated with whatever it is that's driving this. I mean, our own British Office of National Statistics, so keen to tell us how many people were dying of COVID, suddenly stopped in May 22 and said there was no need to release all these statistics anymore. And we knew why, and that's because they were correlating with the vaccine rollout and the boosters in particular. And we've only just got the Department of the Office of National Statistics to release the data, but it's in such a mess, it's going to take quite a while to put it together. So what are they hiding? We know that they're hiding. The MHRA, we have approached them. I've written letters with my colleagues again and again. They've only replied to one to let us know they received the letter and that they're the best regulatory body in the entire world, and we're lucky to have them. This is a degree of complacency and complete contempt for not only the population and the patients, but the profession. I mean, I was one of 100 really eminent physicians, epidemiologists, pathologists, you name it, GPs, health leaders who signed this, and we don't even get the courtesy of a detailed reply. And I know people here in Australia say similar things. So what is going on when it affects so many countries? There's just this gigantic cover-up. The mistake is horrendous. I mean, it makes thalidomide look like nothing compared to what it was, because thalidomide just affected thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, but this has affected billions, and there's been no remorse, no trying to rectify all the damage that's been done, not even an apology. Just what I received yesterday. We did our best. We were doing the best. Nobody would have done it different. And it's easy to see things in retrospect. And here I say, I'm not seeing things in retrospect. I was there as soon as that sequence was released in January 2020. My Norwegian colleagues, who I've designed a very good HIV vaccine with, which incidentally, Fauci and Gates seem to have done everything they can to prevent proceeding, which is something which I only now start to see what might be going on. But when they saw that sequence, they said it's got 6 inserts in this sequence. This cannot arise naturally. It's impossible. And unlike my colleagues who told me, of course, these things can arise by chance, a mere chance mutation, my colleagues who I worked with, they seem to be far brighter, and it's made me realize that my so-called expert friends are not very clever at all, because you cannot have changes in sequences unless they translate to amino acids and proteins, and that's what happens, with any gene, makes a protein, etc. And immediately they spotted that the charge, nobody else looked at the charge of these proteins on that SARS-2 virus was over 8. Now, what's relevant here is the charge of any natural virus never exceeds 6. So this was highly unusual, and in no time at all, we could find evidence that Wuhan had published papers where they had inserted 1 or 2 of these inserts to increase the charge and infectability. So it wasn't actually exactly Sherlockian to work this out. Of course, we were completely told to shut up, be quiet. The papers rejected from Nature, Science, Lancet with the same letter. This is not in the public interest. Therefore, we can't publish it. Within 5 hours in the case of Nature, within less than a day in all of them, the same letter. This was something that was constructed and going on. And then just to realize, when I realized just how horrible, horrendous this was, we found the spike protein, which every single vaccine maker or designer chose to use as the vaccine. We showed that 80% of that spike protein had homologies to human epitopes, and therefore it was guaranteed to cause horrendous side effects if you used this. We particularly found complete homologies in a thing called platelet factor 4 and myelin, and that would mean that you have high chance of getting clots, microclots, strokes and everything from the platelet interference, Guillain-Barré, all sorts of neurological things, both of which have happened. This is not retrospect, because I immediately gave this paper to the government through Michael Gove, who gave it to all the relevant cabinet members, Chris Whitty, Vallance, Farrar, Sage. They all saw it and decided to ignore it. So there's no way they're ever going to hold it's easy in retrospect. No, we saw it in retrospect and warned them, and we were dismissed. Whitty dismissed me as a oncologist, cancer doctor. What do I know? Well, I spent 30 years designing vaccines, HIV and cancer vaccines, and I know a hell of a lot more than he did. I discovered the receptor for HIV, the CD4 receptor, and everything involved with infectivity and pathogenesis. And so we rapidly applied that to the SARS-2. And we were able to come up and make these predictions, everything in absolute confidence with less than 2 weeks of research. Why has it taken 4 years now before the world admits, well, it probably did come from the lab? when I believe the data we presented was 100%, that it could not possibly have been a human, a natural back to human virus.
And when was that, Professor?
We did that it was published late January. We were communicating February, official papers submitted beginning of March, and to the cabinet too. We thought it was of such national security, we actually submitted it to the cabinet. Sir Richard Dearlove got involved, and he backed me. And he told them that he backed me. In fact, he told them. So I had this from a colleague of his. He said that if the MRC and the Wellcome Trust and the NIH are all convinced it's a natural virus, jump from a bat to human, and he said, Professor Dalgleish says it's absolutely convinced that it came from the lab and escaped, then he would back me over all the others, having done total diligence. And this involved knocking on the door of my colleagues and if people I've worked with on Sunday evenings to check me out, plus going through all my papers and references and everything. So they cannot say they did not know, but something held it. And I know because Sir Richard Dearlove, it went through Five Eyes. So it went to the United States, it went to Canada, it went to Australia, and it went to New Zealand. So I know that, and that's why Trump decided it had come from the lab. You remember that famous thingy? I've seen evidence. He said that 2 days after we sent our information, and we sent it to Fauci thinking that he was a collaborator. He was the enemy. He muffled it. He killed it because it interfered with his global plan of rolling out very profitable but useless, dangerous vaccines.
Just expand on your experience, especially you are an eminent professor in this field. That is known by the world, and your achievements are public. How could your peers and those around you turn away from you and ignore what you had said?
I don't know, but I bet it was rather like being condemned and found guilty in a court of your peers. And I mean, I found it really, really hard. I found it incredibly stressful that people who are friends of mine, who I thought were friends, basically shunned me, told me to stop stepping outside your area of expertise and be quiet, shut up. My own medical school said that it was, they sent a missive around, said the medical school had made it illegal to discuss the origin of the virus. We weren't to do it. And I had to turn around and say, well, I've already submitted it. It's clearly from the lab. And we all know why this happened. They were all terrified of Chinese because Chinese now fund nearly all the major universities in the United Kingdom. So this is another big issue behind it. And I was warned to watch my back by many friends who weren't joking either. And that's how seriously they took it. From my point of view, I thought, well, I'm not going to be silenced because I'm telling the truth. And then the second instance of this, when I clearly saw that the booster vaccines were causing cancer in front of my eyes, and I was experienced enough to know this was not anecdotal, pure coincidence. I was absolutely sure. I'm a very good clinician. I pick things up. I can usually tell the results of randomized trials just in half a dozen patients. Of course, you're not allowed to say things like that. You've got to have these enormous randomized trials. So I knew this was real. And once again, I was told by my own colleagues to be quiet, shut up, provide absolute proof because I was upsetting their patients. I mean,
we had a doctor here named Dr. Mel Washer, who was a member of Parliament from Western Australia. And I had some sort of cold. It turns out I had hay fever. And he said, Russell, I am the best diagnostician in the world.
That's brave to say that.
It was brave to say that. But he said, it was words to that effect, that he said, no, this is one thing that I am very, very, very good at. And your colleagues know that of you. How could they, after all those years, say all of a sudden you've lost the plot?
Yes, well, I mean, I was called to the hospital directors I was carpeted by the Royal College of Physicians for saying this, for going against NHS guidelines, breaking NHS. I said, I don't care about NHS guidelines. I said, I'm first and foremost a physician, and I first and foremost act by my oath, first do no harm. At any rate, in both cases, I explained to them what was going on. And I said, up to now, you are basically guilty of medical incompetence. I said, if you persist in getting everybody to have a forceful booster vaccine, a COVID vaccine, patients and staff, I said, now I've explained everything to you and I've articles fully referenced, etc. on this. If you persist with this, you will be committing medical negligence. And because this is killing people, it will be criminal negligence, which I'd like to remind you carries a custodial sentence. And in both cases, I walked out the boardroom and ended the interrogation by the Royal College of Physicians.
Wow. So today in the UK Telegraph, COVID vaccines could be partly to blame for the rise in excess deaths since the pandemic.
Yes.
Scientists have suggested now.
Mm.
Well, 4 years since you raised the alarm.
Well, to be quite honest, with the cancer incident rise, it was about 18 months since I raised the alarm, because the cancer rise instance was only clearly evident after the booster. And it was the booster. And just so to tell you why it is the booster, it is that first of all, my 3 decades of developing vaccines, there's a simple adage: if a vaccine needs a booster, it doesn't work. I mean, that's a global adage. There are obviously exceptions, like tetanus, you need to boost every 10 years or so. But if you need a booster after your first or second because the response wanes, then it clearly doesn't work. It's a waste of time doing the booster. And what we measured was that when you give a booster, you lose the T-cell response. And it is the T-cell response that controls respiratory viruses. It is the T-cell response that keeps your cancer. You and I have got cancers burbling away at the moment, and they are controlled by a very good T-cell immune system. Once you have some significant suppression of this, and in my melanoma patients over the years who we've knocked into full remission, they've lasted years. And then I have seen this relapse before, and I know it's a T-cell one we measured responses, but it goes with serious depression, serious bereavements, divorce, bankruptcy, this sort of thing lasting 3 months. And we know that that's associated with a big switch off in T-cell. But that's why people get ill and die after events like this. Yeah. But in all the patients I witnessed, none of this was the case. But it was very clearly the boosters, and this fulfilled the T-cell suppression that we predicted. And then wonderfully, other people have published this. They've actually published in great detail. They called it T-cell exhaustion after booster COVID vaccination in cancer patients. I mean, so it's not just me speculating, it's actually out there. And other groups have shown that the neutralizing antibodies that the first two do induce, but they're transient and useless. By the time you've induced them, the virus has mutated and escaped. But those antibodies after the booster switch to a tolerization subset. And that's what you try to induce if you have a kidney transplant or a renal transplant, so the antibodies don't reject it. And so we are actually doing the opposite with the COVID vaccination program for that which we would ideally want. We're actually making people more susceptible to other more susceptible to other infections which the T cells normally control, flu, other RSV, all these other things that are going up. And that is why the Cleveland Clinic, which is the closest thing to a big public health system, although it's private in the US, they have been reporting the effects of their vaccination program on their staff and patients very openly. And since they introduced the booster, they've shown that you're 3.5 times more likely to get infected than if you don't have the booster. So they've stopped giving the vaccines. And I point this out at home and say, why our GPs still phoning everybody up over 70, hounding them to get a booster to protect them, to make them safe, when it's going to make them less safe, more likely to develop cancer. It is beyond belief that nobody is looking at the evidence. Nobody, the science is not being debated. And we were lied to, follow the science, they said. The science has said, no, it wasn't. There was never any debate. In fact, writing this up, I just so I suddenly realized it was here. I didn't put it deliberately. But over this time, I've published 2 books. Here, if I can hold that up. There, can you see that? The first, The Origin of the Virus, which we documented this. And Stephen Key, who was the main person who presented all this data to the American Congress, he basically co-wrote with me on that. And I'm really, really, really pleased. And the second one, when I realized nobody was actually following any science, that when I was co-writing the problems with the lockdown and all the knock-on effects this would have, a colleague who's published a lot of books, Professor Paul Goddard, said, I would like to contribute to this, it's very important. And after he put his contributions in, I did say to him, I said, do you realize we are documenting the death of science? And he said, great title. That's the title of the book, and that is the title of the book, The Death of Science. And after that, we had lots of people say we want to contribute to this in our own field. This is what we see as being killed. Science is completely being killed and sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. And it's not just what we've seen with the pandemic. I mean, the great parallel that we've seen is the climate change carry on. It's exactly the same there, that debate weighing up the benefits, etc., has been completely stifled by those who have their own agenda. And the parallels between the way the pandemic was handled and global climate change are unbelievably similar, in my view. And of course, we examine that in the book as well.
That's the science is settled argument. In Australia, we have the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which we believe is a world first and we're very proud of. What are the ramifications for such a scheme, government-provided scheme, costing billions of dollars in Australia, a small country, but costing billions of dollars, and trying to be wound back now? What are the ramifications for injury for such a scheme? Are we about to see an absolute wave of injured people claiming on the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia?
Yes, you are. And a lot of them have probably tried already. We're having the same problem in the UK, but the government keep raising the bar. You've basically got to be disabilitated enough not to be able to be fit enough to make the claim in the first place in order to be considered. It's absolute disgrace. Now here, I and my colleagues are fully aware of the government situation, and we have made it very, very clear. The governments very foolishly gave indemnity to the vaccine makers like Pfizer and Moderna, but they gave indemnity for the product. They did not give indemnity for criminal behavior. They did not give indemnity for fraudulently withholding the phase 1 data, for only showing good data, which was again fabricated. The claim that the vaccine was 95% effective, it was one of the biggest smoke and screen. And I admit it, I'm not into the epidemiology and statistics the way one of my very good colleagues has explained it. But 95% efficiency was relative risk efficiency. If you say, what does that mean? Absolute risk, it's 0.84. Oh, what does that mean? I, as a clinician, want to know, how many people do I have to vaccinate to prevent one infection? That figure comes out at 118. Nobody in their right mind would vaccinate 118 people to prevent one infection. And that was pulled under all the regulators passed this nonsense. It's now all being taken apart. So the regulators were incompetent or bribed one way or the other. All of them, unfortunately. There's no really good one who stood up to this. And the other thing is the the clinicians were bribed, the regulators were clearly bribed on this. And again, people would say, oh, this is outrageous, ludicrous claims. No, it's not. Pfizer have paid out billions. The first survey I found out, they'd paid out 31 billion fines to the FDA for presenting fraudulent data, withholding important negative data, bribing clinicians and bribing regulators. They carry on as if that's part of the costs of doing business. Now with the pandemic, I would say bribing all political people and people who fed in, because it's the only explanation for what's happened. And the bribery goes with the fear. And that's the other thing I uncovered was that.
Well, I call fear debt. They have the same amount, same number of words in them. Debt. I didn't understand that colleagues, younger colleagues like of yours, they have mortgages that are in the millions.
Mm.
So their whole, as you mentioned before, their whole life is threatened. Their whole lifestyle is threatened. Everything's threatened if they didn't go along with what your National Health Service was saying, our health department was saying. And I am very forgiving of my parliamentary colleagues and the former leaders in this country, because they actually believed what they were being told.
Yes, that's true. They did actually believe what they've been told.
I can forgive them for that and say, all right, but let's face up to it now, because what you're telling me, if I've gleaned this correctly, is that the whole of society's immune system has been diminished, and therefore a future event, the whole of society will not, except for the unvaccinated, will not have the immune system to stand against it.
I believe that obviously there's different degrees of this and different degrees of people, but I do believe that the messenger RNA viruses in particularly have lasting damage, and we must do everything we can to ameliorate this as much as possible. The damage from the messenger RNA viruses, I mean, rather horrifying. They may set in progress for cancer to be arising in people over the next 2 to 3 years, which would not otherwise have risen for the next 20, 30 years. That's one of my very big concerns. But my bottom line I was making with that prior statement was that in one line, the politicians and the governments may have given indemnity to Pfizer and Moderna for their product. They did not give indemnity for what they did, and they should be held criminally accountable for those crimes which they've been found guilty of before, except this time it affected billions of people. So they must be. I actually believe this is Nuremberg trial territory. I really do, because so many people have been injured. You go close to me, nothing to do with my practice. I've had 3 friends who had to have the booster to travel. This is the onerous, the mandatory. They couldn't travel to, in fact, all 3 cases, it was something to do, 2 of them were their wife's 70th birthday. They wanted to travel to places, and they said, if you don't have a booster vaccine within so many days, you can't travel. So they had it. And 2 of my friends they phoned me and they felt awful after the booster. They got what I thought was rather like long COVID, and I was trying to coach them through, it's like a long COVID. And that, by the way, I've seen more long COVID caused by vaccination than I ever saw caused by the actual virus infection.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. And then in no time at all, I mean, no time at all, I'm talking weeks, they were complaining of like serious back pain and what have you. And in both cases, I said, you've got to have a scan immediately. And in both cases, the GP said, oh, well, I'll give you a telephone appointment in 3 weeks. This is how our GP services collapsed. I said, you're both well off, pay for it privately. They both had scans and they both had metastases down their back and in their pelvis. One of them's already dead. The disease was so widespread that even the new immunotherapy didn't work. The other is hanging in. And then I found another friend coming over for a do who joins us from America who'd had lymphoma. He had to have a booster for this flight. The lymphoma came back and killed him. So he didn't even get to, in all three cases, the people didn't get to travel for the reason that they had the booster.
Now, Professor, if you know about that, and you have the experience of 3 of your colleagues, that's happening. That must be happening all around the world.
Exactly. That is exactly the case, and I am told so. When I found a colleague at work in another hospital who I actually asked, "How are you?" and they said, "I'm okay. Although I've had a load of lumps come up, and they say I've got lymphoma." And I naively said, "Oh goodness, what caused that?" And this is a stupid question for a doctor to ask, but it was just part of being empathetic with the person. And she said, "Oh, apparently it's the vaccine. My oncologist said they're seeing loads of cases of this." So I said, "Well, have they reported it?" And she said, "Yes, but they were told to keep quiet." I mean, what is the point of being quiet? It's like saying the house is on fire. Phone the fire brigade. Well, don't tell anybody. We're not allowed to come round. It's out of NHS guidelines. I mean, this is the madness that I was witnessing. And I found that is very mentally stressing to actually think that the world really has gone mad in an Orwellian way. It's just unbelievable.
Well, you can imagine how I've struggled over the last 4 years because in the same way, I came out immediately and said there's something fishy going on here, because I had 3 people come to me. I had a gynecologist who was working at the local hospital come to me and say, "I cannot give these to my patients. I cannot give to my clients." I had a GP who came to me and said, "Russell, I'm leaving my practice today because my practice want to give these vaccines out." He said, "I don't trust them. They're wrong. I would not recommend you take them, or anybody else." And then I had a retired GP who had written a whole thesis on this type of issue. And she said to me, "Russell, what's going to happen here is you're going to end up with a pandemic of the vaccinated."
Yeah, they're completely right. A totally accurate prophecy.
And that was in 2020. Right. And so I came out and I didn't say don't take the vaccines. I wasn't a doctor. But I did put a position that put me at odds with the whole of my community. And the abuse was unbelievable for someone who, and from our national broadcaster of all things, and the local Rural Doctors Association, that I was putting out misinformation. I didn't put out any information. I asked a question.
Well, that was it, this misinformation. I've been guilty of spreading misinformation. I found that they were running a central disinformation unit. It was set up by David Cameron. And I think it was meant to be for terrorism and etc. Except it went into full turbocharged mode when the COVID pandemic came out. Somebody told me that they'd found out that by questioning various things, they had actually been put on it. It's like a terrible thing. It means you're equivalent of a suspected terrorist in the way it was said.
Yeah.
And he recommended that I went through the mechanisms to see if I had been reported to it. And it wasn't just like an ordinary freedom of information. This person had to get me a whole load of forms to fill in and send to various places, which I wouldn't even have known existed. So I would not known of this, that they hadn't suspected. And when it came back, they finally released it. It looked like I had been reported nearly 24 times, not once or twice, 24 times. I was up there on the front because I had several questioning the origin of the virus, so that this was misinformation. Then I was very public. I wrote lots of articles in the Telegraph and the Daily Mail. I had dozens of articles in the Daily Mail saying the lockdown is wrong, stop it now. And I had an enormous amount of support for that. The newspaper really ran and pushed with that. As soon as I pointed out that there was a problem with the vaccines, I wrote the script, they passed the sub-editor, they never appeared. And the people who commissioned say, terribly sorry, something more important came up, and the editor said we'd keep it back for another day. That's like decades in the future. And I suddenly realized the mainstream media were not going to go anywhere near this.
Yeah.
And this is right at the beginning. And then with the cancer story, I told all my contacts and colleagues there, and they also say we're not allowed to insinuate the vaccines cause this, that, and the other until there's absolute proof. Of course, nobody is being funded to look at the proof, and those people who have the proof are being told to withhold it. And we have the case with the Office of National Statistics saying they will only reveal the details to the drug companies who made the vaccines because it is commercial confidentiality. I'd regard mass slaughter as not actually being a commercial confidential situation.
What's the tipping point?
I think we're at it. I do. I think the fact you and I are talking here, I've been talking to so many people here in Australia. The fact when I go back, within a week of me landing, I'm going to another big event in Britain, which is founded by Tessa Lowry, who's trying to push for an alternative WHO, which I am totally and utterly against. I believe we should leave the WHO. It's now an evil organisation, part of the sort of elite's world power control. And the fact that the people in it, the head of it is Tedros Ghebreyesus, I can never pronounce his name, and our own Farah, Jeremy Farah, used to be head of the Wellcome Trust. We now know he woefully and willingly lied about everything in this pandemic. He was the one who convinced Parliament I was an idiot and didn't know what I was talking about, and that the virus was not from the lab. We now know at the whole time he knew that because there was a telephone conversation which was recorded with Fauci and Farah and Valence, and they agreed to suppress any suggestion that came from the lab, even though Farah's wife thought it did, we now find out. The thing is dreadfully redacted, but it's out there. And it shows that Farah is not a fit and proper person to hold any form of scientific office, let alone the chief scientific advisor for the WHO. So it's therefore a corrupt and criminal organisation who's basically joining. The agenda seems to be very, very clear. They want the ability to control the world, to lock down for the next pandemic, to wreak havoc on us, hold us all in until they produce another useless, dangerous vaccine, which they can all make billions from. And I mean, this is a ludicrous situation. It's never been arisen. And in all my research, I've come up with the people who accuse me of lots of conspiracy theories, and I hold my hand up. But as long as they accept that all the conspiracy theories I've been involved in have all come completely true, well, you know, this is amazing. But I actually believe that a conspiracy theory, which I'm looking into at the moment, will also probably be true. I don't believe that there's been a natural pandemic since the Spanish flu, which was only lethal because of the deprivations of at the end of the First World War. And these people were, if today, this would not have been a mass killer with the antibiotics and things like that. It was just a flu, and they all died of secondary infections, that I believe. But all the other big pandemics, I believe, on serious research and looking at that, all occurred purely because people were messing around with these agents in laboratories and they escaped. And in the book, both The Origins of the Virus and The Death of Science, we point out that there's been 6 major escapes of the SARS-1 virus from really top quality laboratories, you know, in the States, China, Singapore, from the strongest stringent laboratories, it is impossible to prevent those lethal viruses from escaping, and therefore the whole gain of function, i.e. making viruses more effective, for the ludicrous excuse so we can make better vaccines against them when they become available. Now, Obama had the sense to ban all this gain of function stuff, which is why Fauci went behind his back and did it under the table, financing Peter Daszak and the Eco Health Alliance, who then funded it all to be done in the Wuhan laboratory. And here is the rub. Ralph Barrick was the only person who could really stitch RNA together very well. So he was given a load of money by Fauci to participate in it. And his name's on all the papers. So once again, no Sherlock's needed. I mean, the paper trail's all out there. And at the bottom of these papers, which are gain of function papers, it's basically, I've actually seen it physically, the papers myself. It goes back to that money came from the NIAID by Tony Fauci after he denied this. And you know, Paul Rand is onto him big time over this for lying to the Senate, and all that is ongoing, and I hope it plays out as it should.
Professor, thanks for your time. What message? I normally ask what message have you got for my Prime Minister, Health Minister, and Disability Services Minister, but I'm going to ask you, what message have you got for the Australian people?
The message I have for the Australian people is that, well, first of all, I'm extremely sorry that, like the British people and people all around the world, that the governments and their health ministers and the doctors allowed this to happen to them when there was evidence out there to say that this pandemic should have been handled in a totally different way. I don't believe the vaccines were ever necessary. I believe the whole thing was played out to roll this vaccine out. And what other reason is there but for money? And I mean, one of your colleagues said they regard this as the greatest transference from poor tax-paying people to the ultra wealthy since the Second World War. And I mean, that is the case, but it's looking increasingly like it was planned. And I would say to the great people, do not trust the people who make these decisions in the future unless there's a complete, open, transparent debate and all the evidence. Nobody should ever say, ever again, this is a national emergency, we're taking over control. Just do what we say. We must never allow that to happen again. Amen.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, God bless you and keep you. Thank you for being on with us today. I look forward to hearing of your reports when you get back to the UK and your further work. It's interesting that Isaiah 40 talks about those older people who will run and not get weary, and you've found you're right at that point at the end of Isaiah 40.
Yeah, thank you.
Good on you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.